Welcome back, everyone, to our two-part series on Diamond Comic Distributors. Last time in part one, we saw how Diamond Comics rose from a Baltimore backroom to dominate the comic book industry. For over 20 years, they were the only way shops could get Marvel, DC, Image Comics, and every other major title. But in the shadow of that monopoly, pressure was building. And in this video, we examined the collapse from pandemic shutdowns and publisher defections to late shipments, damaged books, rising debt, and a leadership team caught flat-footed. This is how Diamond lost control of the direct market and how the entire comic book industry was forced to change. We pick up Diamond's story in 2019 when Steve Geppi announced he was taking a step back from day-to-day operations. He stayed on as chairman and CEO of Geppi Family Enterprises, but stepped down as president. He called it semi-retirement, but joked that it just meant working down to 60 hours per week instead of his usual grind. And then 2020 happened, and the COVID pandemic turned the world upside down. Comic shops across the country were forced to close their doors, and they turned to online live sales and switched to curbside pickup for some. The whole industry faced an existential crisis. Diamond had to make a tough call. Retailers were in wildly different situations depending on location. Some were open, some were closed, some were barely hanging on. If Diamond kept shipping comics, shops that were closed might not be able to pay for their orders. If new comics kept coming out while some stores were closed, readers might switch to mail order or digital, potentially killing off local shops permanently. So Diamond made a decision that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. They stopped shipping everything. Complete shutdown. What was meant to be temporary ended up lasting about 2 months. And let me tell you, the major publishers were not happy. The executives at the big publishers started asking hard questions about whether Diamond still made sense as their only distribution partner. DC Comics didn't wait around for an answer. In June of 2020, they became the first to jump ship, announcing they were switching to two brand new distributors. UCS, which was connected to Midtown Comics in New York, and Lunar Distribution tied to the discount comic book service out west. This was a massive deal. The monopoly was finally broken. Geppi cut his semi-retirement short and rushed back to provide guidance and leadership to Diamond in July of 2020. But the damage was already done. Marvel followed DC's lead in March 2021, moving their distribution to Penguin Random House. Then it was a cascade. Dark Horse, IDW, and others all announcing new distribution deals. The exodus was on. Diamond's position collapsed practically overnight. They went from the only distributor in town to just another option, and often, to tell you the truth, not even the best one. They still had some rights to distribute Marvel as a wholesaler, but DC was completely gone from the US operation. To get DC Comics, shops now had to go through UCS or Lunar Distribution. One bright spot remained, though. Diamond UK continued to distribute DC and other publishers in Europe. But in the US, the company's business was shrinking fast. Geppi tried to stay positive, pointing to Alliance Game Distributors as a division that was still thriving. He said, "Alliance is really a juggernaut right now and does extremely well," he insisted. But despite all of Geppi's optimism, Diamond was in serious trouble, and I mean serious. In May of 2023, the situation went from bad to worse when Image Comics, the third largest publisher and one of Diamond's few remaining big accounts, jumped ship and signed an exclusive distribution deal with Lunar Distribution. Industry consultant Adam Freeman didn't mince words. Image moving over really began the beginning of the end. Things had gotten so bad that Diamond had to cut staff and restructure, eventually downsizing to about 60% of its former size by mid to late 2023. They had to close their Plattsburgh, New York warehouse earlier than they had planned due to a sudden lease termination in November of 2024. They scrambled to consolidate everything to their Olive Branch location, but that's only when the real nightmare began. This rushed move triggered widespread shipping delays and invoicing chaos, particularly hurting retailers over the hectic holiday season. Shipping delays became the norm. Damaged products started showing up at comic shops in even greater record numbers. We're talking bent comics, crushed corners, water damage, absolute disasters for products that are sold partly on their collectible condition. Some store owners reported that up to 30% of each shipment arrived damaged and completely unsellable. And believe me, as a comic collector myself, it hurts just saying that. People who had been watching the industry closely all had the same criticism. Diamond had failed to adapt. They had lost most of their business, but hadn't modernized their operations or fixed their fundamental problems. Even with a smaller publisher lineup, they were still struggling with the most basic aspects of their job, getting comics to stores on time and in sellable condition. Then came the news that shocked absolutely no one. On January 14, 2025, Diamond Comic Distributors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. So, in a letter to retailers, Diamond President Chuck Parker blamed it all on a few things: the unexpected loss of certain exclusive publisher relationships, compounded by an overall contraction in consumer spending, increased inflation, and a loss of margin on key print product lines. I love how he called it unexpected, as if Diamond had nothing to do with publishers leaving or upset retailers. Anyways, the filing revealed some pretty stark numbers, though. It reported total liabilities estimated between 50 million and 100 million, matching its asset value. Penguin Random House topped the list of creditors who were owed a staggering $9 million. Diamond also owed $4 million to Bondi, over $1 million each to Hasbro and Disney Consumer Products. And after later adjustments, they were shown to owe at least $1 million plus to Diamond Entertainment and others who had products on consignment in Diamond warehouses. These are the kind of numbers that sink companies. Diamond had to secure $41 million in debtor in possession financing from JP Morgan Chase just to keep the lights on. They'd received a $39 million stalking horse bid from Universal Distribution, a Canadian distributor, who wanted to buy Alliance Game Distributors from Diamond. Universal also signed a letter of intent to buy Diamond UK as well. Parker tried to reassure everyone that Diamond was committed to continuing business as usual throughout this process and actively looking for buyers for the remaining operations. But the filing with the Maryland Department of Labor told a different story. It wasn't business as usual. If Diamond couldn't find a buyer by April 1st, 2025, they'd shut down completely and lay off all 168 remaining employees. In late March 2025, the bankruptcy court prepared for the sale of Diamond's assets. Alliance Entertainment outbid everyone at approximately $72 million, becoming the tentative winner. However, a later revelation that Wizards of the Coast would not renew a major game distribution contract with Diamond blew the deal up. Alliance walked away in late April. The court then approved the backup bid. Universal Distribution and Ad Populum took over the remaining assets. By May, Universal had secured Alliance Game Distributors, and Ad Populum had claimed Diamond's core comic and book divisions. It's important to note that Diamond UK was never part of the U.S. asset sale. Universal Distribution held a stalking horse stake in the UK arm and is expected to complete that acquisition soon. For now, Diamond UK continues to distribute Marvel, DC, Image, and other publishers across Britain and Europe, remain largely untouched by the upheaval in North America. What started as a high-stakes auction ultimately splintered Diamond's empire. Its games arm and European distribution lives on with Universal, while the heart of Diamond was passed on to new ownership, in a future that's still up in the air. We don't know what Ad Populum's plans are, whether they're going to continue distribution or shut everything down. Well, in May 2025, Penguin Random House officially severed its remaining ties with Diamond, ending all sub-distributor agreements. Udon Entertainment stopped shipments. Lawsuits began to surface. The fallout was swift. Massive layoffs, closure of Diamond Select toys, and continued shipping chaos for retailers. So now let's take a step back and let's look at the bigger picture. Diamond Comic Distributors didn't collapse overnight, and it wasn't undone by a single decision or event. Its fall was the result of compounding failures, missed opportunities, and a rapidly changing industry that left them behind. In this final segment, we'll break down the key factors that I believe, or in my opinion, led to Diamond's bankruptcy in 2025. You or others may have other opinions, but I believe these are the major factors. Number one, the publisher exodus. Diamond's most notable downward turn began with the loss of its most valuable partners. As I discussed earlier, in 2020, DC Comics broke ranks and walked away, and in 2021, Marvel followed suit. That double hit stripped Diamond of its exclusive control of the two largest comic brands in North America. What followed was a slow but steady erosion of its publisher base. Image, Dark Horse, IDW all moving to newer, more agile distribution partners. Without exclusives, Diamond lost the leverage that it wants to find its role in the industry. It didn't just lose business, it lost its identity as the sole distribution pipeline. Number two, I would say, would be operational failures. It wasn't just the publisher who left. Retailers were pushed away too by Diamond's inability to deliver on basic expectations. As mentioned earlier, retailers had long complaints about shipments arriving late, damaged, or both. And in an industry where condition matters and timing is everything, Diamond was slipping. And while these issues had been simmering for years, they boiled over in the pandemic years. And later, when the company closed its Plattsburgh warehouses and consolidated operations. What was meant to cut costs ended up cutting quality even more. Instead of addressing these operational problems head on, Diamond often defaulted to silence or delay, eroding trust with the very people who relied on them the most. My number three is a little bit more of a sensitive issue because it starts to look at factors that were slightly outside the control of Diamond. Diamond still has to take some responsibility, but there might be some responsibility on the part of retailers and customers. And that is what I call number three, the financial programs and pull list issues. Diamond's generous credit lines, once seen as a lifeline for struggling comic shops, turned into a financial trap for both parties. For decades, shops had been able to order comics on credit, paying weeks later with the expectation that customer pull lists, which were like ongoing subscriptions, would convert those issues into sales. However, as long as pull lists have existed, customers abandoning pull lists and not paying for their orders has been a problem too. But when COVID hit, the economy turned and buying habits changed. Customers stopped showing up for their pulls in even larger numbers. Retailers were left holding enormous amounts of unsold inventory they were still obligated to pay for. The result? A ballooning number of unpaid invoices from comic shops. Diamond's balance sheets filled with uncollectible debts, and the company can no longer rely on predictable cash flow from its core clients, the retailers. The same system that supported the direct market and saved many retailers for decades now became one of its weakest links. Number four is market contraction and rising costs. All of this was happening against a backdrop of macroeconomic pressure. Inflation drove up shipping and labor costs, squeezing Diamond's already thin margins. At the same time, the comic book market was changing. The comic shop ecosystem, once the foundation of Diamond's empire, was contracting due to new distributors on the scene. Publishers and retailers looked for new ways to reach readers, and Diamond, saddled with legacy infrastructure and high overhead, struggled to keep up. It wasn't just that Diamond was losing publishers, it was that the whole world around them was shifting and their business model wasn't flexible enough to shift with it. And number five, I want to talk about what I consider a leadership gap. When Steve Geppi stepped back in 2019, longtime COO Chuck Parker took over as president. While Parker had decades of experience in operations and finance, he did lack Geppi's passion for comics, his strong industry relationships, and his instinct for bold moves. Parker's leadership was steady but conservative, better suited for maintaining than reinvention. As Diamond's world began unraveling, the company needed someone who could lead a transformation, rally the industry, and chart a new path forward. Instead, it got cautious statements, delayed decisions, and reactive policies. It's not that Parker mismanaged the company, but he managed it as if lots of the old rules still applied. By the time Geppi had returned to a more active role, the momentum had shifted. The chance to adapt had already slipped away. The sixth factor I want to discuss is the monopoly mindset of Diamond. For over 20 years, Diamond operated as a near monopoly. It didn't have to compete, so it didn't. Innovation stalled. Retailer service plateaued. The infrastructure aged. For many comic shops, dealing with Diamond became a ritual of frustration, but they had no alternative. Then suddenly they did. Lunar Distribution offered faster, cleaner shipments. Penguin Random House offered deeper discounts and free freight. These competitors didn't just match Diamond, they outpaced them. And Diamond, so used to being the only game in town, was unprepared. Their systems weren't built for competition, and their internal culture wasn't enough. They had gotten used to being indispensable. They never imagined they wouldn't be. And number seven is probably the least impactful of the factors, and that is really once Diamond filed for bankruptcy, the bankruptcy mechanics themselves were a blow. When Diamond finally filed for Chapter 11 in January 2025, it wasn't just a cry for help. It was an admission that the old model was no longer viable and that they needed to restructure. But bankruptcy introduced new problems that would limit their ability to do that. It limited Diamond's ability to collect from retailers. It exposed publicly the full scope of its debts, including massive unpaid invoices from shops, publishers, and suppliers. And with those things going public, it would definitely impact other businesses' choices to do business with Diamond. It triggered layoffs and further service slowdowns. Asset sales like Alliance Game Distributors going to Universal and the Diamond comic brand itself being absorbed by Ad Populum marked really the dismantling of a once mighty company. Diamond wasn't reorganizing, it was unraveling. So, with all that, I just want to say Diamond's collapse wasn't sudden. It was slow, systemic, and avoidable in many ways. It was caused by an industry shifting gears and a company that stayed stuck in neutral. They didn't just lose their monopoly, they lost the trust of retailers, the loyalty of publishers, and the relevance that once made them essential. Their story is a warning and a legacy. So, what comes next? Diamond's fall is rippling through the industry. In the short term, we've seen chaos, supply chain breakdowns, delayed shipments, and significant financial strain on both indie publishers as well as publishers that Diamond owes a lot of money to. We're starting to see retailers struggling with getting merchandise on their shelves, publishers that are unable to pay their own creators, printers, or staff, certain comic titles being suspended, delayed projects, or pivots to crowdfunding projects. If bankruptcy court settlements don't favor the publishers, we may see more layoffs in the long run, or even a few imprints vanish entirely. Now, in the long term, this could be good for the comic ecosystem if the new players can deliver reliability and service, modernize and create flexible systems, and provide support for the small indie publishers, not just the big publishers. The general sentiment among several retailers seemed to be that the collapse might finally push the direct market to become more professional, but only if the reinvention happens instead of reverting to our old habits. If true, then I personally am hopeful that if retailers and publishers can survive the chaotic transformation we are currently experiencing, this systemic change can really strengthen the comic industry for years to come. And I just want to say thanks for joining me today, and I hope you saw part one as I dove down, deep down, the rabbit hole of Diamond Comics Distributors history. If you've worked in comics, collected comics, or lived through this history, drop a comment below. Share what you think. Was the moment Diamond sealed its own fate? What do you think are the contributing factors? Did I miss one, or do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Love to have a conversation with you down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like and subscribe, especially if you want to see me do more content like this. And as always, stay geeky, my friends. Stay geeky. Until next time, later.